It's not like the lights on or anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Hi, and welcome to Peoria Riverfront Museum's Viewing Room Live. You've probably seen a number of these we've done in the past, and I am so happy and thrilled to do this one for a number of reasons. I want to introduce somebody who is with me in a minute, but first, I would like to thank Sharon and John Amdahl for really supporting and sponsoring an exhibition that Peoria Riverfront Museum has up right now called Angle Edge Plane, the works of Ronald Bladen, the subject of our discussion tonight. That exhibition was assisted by Sam Yates at University of Tennessee and the estate of Ronald Bladen and the Loretta Howard Gallery in New York City. All of these entities and people I cannot thank enough for making this happen. I also want to thank our Visionary Society members, without which this would not happen, our regular members, of course. And lastly, I want to mention, before we get going, after you see what our guest is going to talk about today, you are going to want to come to our bookstore and take a look at this monograph, this amazing book, which is brand new, on the work of Ronald Bladen, who is the artist sculptor of our own in Peoria, Illinois, our largest public commission sculpture, Sonar Tide, which is one of the reasons we're doing this tonight. So please visit the museum and check out our bookstore for that book. With me is Mark Holmes, who is the chair of the Art and Art History Department at Knox College. Mark, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You're very welcome. We asked Mark to be with us for a number of reasons. Mark is a sculptor. He actually, I think, has a kind of investment in minimalism. Am I right, Mark?
That's fair, and in Ronald Bladen.
You can see my screen, Mark. Is that correct? Does that look good to you?
Yes, that's what you want. Yep.
All right. Well, Ronald Bladen is an interesting figure in art, in contemporary art, in sculpture particularly. Tell us about the impact of Ronald Bladen in a sentence or two in terms of how we are going to discuss him tonight, how his impact on the trajectory of American art is.
Yes. Bladen is a major. It's really impossible to overemphasize what an important figure Bladen is, particularly in the 60s and into the 70s in the history of American sculpture. Bladen was part of a seminal exhibit in New York in 1966 at the Jewish Museum called the Primary Structures Show, which is remembered as one of the great and sort of iconic moments, honestly, in the history of American art and in the history globally of contemporary art. Probably the most important exhibit in New York, at least, since the Armory show 50 years or so earlier. The show ushers in, introduces Americans to, or at least the New York gallery scene, to minimalism, which is not a word that any of the artists themselves might have chosen, but it was a title given to them. And minimalism was it can't be overemphasized what an impact it had on the art world. Minimalism represented in its most orthodox and sort of concentrated articulations by people like Donald Judd in particular in his writings. It represented a complete rejection of the kind of historical values, the humanist and kind of Enlightenment values and language that American had inherited from European modernism. So things like the notion that art needs to be expressive, sort of psychologically or emotionally expressive, that art should take up metaphysical meanings, or that it should be anthropomorphic, that it should relate to the human form in any way, be it literal or just in terms of its kind of abstract movements. All of these things are things that minimalism sought to eradicate from art, really, wanted to empty out of art and replace with a kind of bold, new American vision for what art can be. Very pragmatic in tone. I think the word that is often used is blunt, a kind of bluntness. In that way, it's not unlike pop art, what Warhol, for instance, had tried to do. And in some ways, it's not unlike what abstract expressionism had set out to do, to create this bold new vision for what American art would be, that divorced itself of its European sources.
Mark, if I could interject, one thing you mentioned to me, which I find just something that I don't want our viewers to go away, whether they know a lot about art or they don't. In the screen that they are looking at now, on the left half, I have included a couple of images by who you have already referenced, abstract expressionists. Probably the first truly American fine art achievement, and followed by, on the second side, a number of pop artists, probably more well-known or popular with the public, both of which absolutely American. And you told me, and I think you're exactly right, that minimalism really takes the best of both of these worlds as it moves toward potentially a more dogmatic way of talking about art, but this idea of replication, of the pre-made object that you would find in pop art, as well as this kind of heroism or the sublime, the large, the heroic approach to scale.
Well, yes, I mean, that becomes a fascinating and expansive conversation. Ultimately, it's interesting what you see in Pollock, for instance, the painting. Pollock, the great abstract expressionist painter, who's represented in the upper left there. What you see in Pollock is a reduction of a painting to a single field, an expanse of a kind of a single activity, something that is not made up of an elaborate relationship of parts. It is what Donald Judd might refer to in his writings as a non-relational art, this sense of all overness, and that Pollock's way of painting really came from his experience growing up on a farm and reaching down to the land, putting a canvas on the floor. He painted in what was quite a pragmatic way, ultimately, sort of a worker-like way, as opposed to an artist with a beret standing at an easel, for instance.
Right.
He wanted to separate himself from that tradition. And so he made huge paintings on the floor as a worker, very much. And I think some of that does seep into the ethos of minimalism. As for pop, of course, is looking to American popular culture, vernacular culture, as its source. And there's a sense in which minimalism, too, does the same. In the same way that Andy Warhol looks to soup cans in Maryland, Donald Judd looks to washing machines, and Carl Andre looks to floor tiles.
Great. That very well codified there. as we move forward, Mark, I'm going to show you an image of Ronald's early work. And
Yeah.
Ronald Bladen started as a painter, probably in that abstract expressionist tree. What can you tell me about
In the 40s. Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. Bladen is actually one of a number of significant, really influential sculptors, particularly in the late 20th century, who come from a painting background. In fact, it's easy to argue that some of the most important contributions to contemporary and modern sculpture have been made by painters. Whether you're talking about Picasso, David Smith was trained as a painter. It might be that they had less reverence for the kind of rules, the academic regulations of what a sculpture needed to be, and were able to free themselves to see sculpture as in a bolder way.
Yeah.
But what Bladen brings to his sculpture, and as it becomes a kind of critique of minimalism itself, is the expressive gesture. That his paintings are the consequence of bodily movements, of a human interaction with materials. And that becomes quite important in understanding his sculpture. That is something we should also say that minimalism very firmly rejected, was the idea that art should exhibit some kind of expressivity through its making. So that the sort of the high priests of minimalism, the few minimalists who sustained their ideology throughout their lifetimes, refused to make their work by hand. They thought it needed to be made by others, particularly if it could be fabricated through manufacturing processes in factories.
And they were searching for a democratization of the process, as well as a democratization of how you would see the resulting work as well.
Yeah, although we don't. I guess we don't want to get into that in any depth. My own view is that their interest in democratization, as such, was less important to them than their need to sort of exclude certain kinds of values from art.
Excellent.
The idea of the human gesture and the kind of human meanings that result from that sort of making.
Well, and as we move forward, the next slide we're going to take a peek at, Mark, is kind of the liftoff point where we are going to begin talking about Bladen in the terms of minimalism, and what, as I think you've done a very nice job so far doing, is setting up this idea that really Bladen does not situate in this world, in this minimalism world. So,
right. No, that's exactly right. Thank you, Bill. Yeah, and so I think we have not yet mentioned that I had the great fortune of meeting Ronnie, as all of his friends called him, late in his life when I was a graduate student at Yale from '83 to '85, doing my MFA in sculpture. He was in fact part of, or my memory isn't altogether clear, but he did a critique on my thesis show at Yale, and I made a couple of remarks that stick with me indelibly. But it was clear, I had been quite interested in his work even as an undergraduate. He was a huge figure on sort of the landscape of sculpture that I understood as a student, even in the Midwest. He was somebody who I admired tremendously. And when I met him, and I don't want to overstate our relationship. I think I met him several times, and I think we went out to lunch after my thesis show. I probably had 3 or 4, a couple of conversations with him in any case. But what really came across to me in those interactions was that he was a person who was sort of deep motivated in a way that you would not at all associate with the kind of values and language of minimalism. He was really a deep soul. He was a poetic personality.
Yeah.
He saw the world in terms of really poetic possibilities.
A romantic.
Yeah, he had been very interested, in fact, and deeply connected to poetry as a younger man, as a younger artist in San Francisco. And so the way that really shows itself and sort of, I think, separates him from other minimalists. And he was also somewhat older than the generation of minimalists who we associate with minimalism. But the way that he really separates himself, again, is that each of his works, and this is consistent throughout his career, I think, there is this kind of almost an exaggerated human gesture to it. Sometimes almost comically exaggerated, actually. But this work, for instance, which was his contribution to the important Jewish Museum show, the Primary Structures show in 1966, 3 elements. It's actually, it was later made in several versions, and this is one of those. One of them is at the Museum of Modern Art in their sculpture courtyard now. But they are these 3 identical objects sharing an identical angle with some distance between them. The distance has been varied depending on their installation. Each of them has a sort of polished, I believe it's aluminum, one aluminum side, or maybe it's stainless steel, but it's a brightly polished side. Almost. And then the other visible sides are black. So they, in the sense, they sort of exaggerate what natural light itself does as it breaks around the corners of buildings and that kinds of things. But their stance, their angle, is the kind of angle that on the one hand, you think of the heroic stance of a great sculptural work like the Balzac, Rodin's great Balzac, the kind of heroic lean of that, and the way the sculpture embodies this kind of belligerence in space,
or a contrapposto of the David or something.
Yeah, perhaps. But it is also, but this angle is also, I believe, it is somewhat not humanly possible for the human body to stand at this angle at least without moving a leg out.
And there's movement in this, Mark. And I told you earlier, I threw a little bit of a trick image in here on the left-hand side.
Oh, right. Yeah.
This concept, this minimal concept was so in the air at this time. This is 2001, of course, Stanley Kubrick's Monolith. But, Bladen's take on the monolith, and I think he had a lot to do with that concept, this all-knowing, this kind of symbol of, this kind of mind over matter, or matter over mind, or some kind of anomaly of both. But tell me what your thoughts are about that, his contribution to the overall, the kind of thinking of the time in terms of how minimalism is situated.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to say. Your use of that image is it from 2001?
It is.
Okay.
Is. Yeah.
But so the question it raises is the relationship of Bladen's thinking to popular imagery, things that would have been known in the wider culture at the time, in the 60s in particular. When we get to some of the later pieces, I think, for instance, Black Lightning is a great example of it, but we can talk more about this.
Let's advance. Let's keep going. But yeah,
Yeah, in those you see, I think a kind of imagery that seems almost to relate to comic book imagery in some
oh, that's
ways.
great. That
And
is
it's exaggerated relationship to the kind of lightning symbolism you might see on the chest of a superhero, that kind of thing. There is a very 60s sensibility to some of the imagery. And Bladen did not shy away from that in the way that minimalists, were supposed to not allow that kind of thing.
yeah,
Make
right.
those sorts of direct associations were to be avoided at all costs.
And you mentioned earlier about this, and absolutely rightfully so, as you well know, that minimalists were so connected to this idea that other people make the work, that they are somehow, their
Yes.
gesture is gone. Yet in these images, we see a different approach, don't we?
Yes, I think he was a maker.
Right.
He loved getting inside. He loved the cutting. I think, I'm also somebody who spent a lot of my life working with wood. I was a furniture maker for many years in between teaching gigs. And I think for people who work with wood, especially, and I'm sure there's members of the audience who can relate to this, there is an infatuation with the process that can take over, a love of the smell and the tools and the sounds. And I think Ronnie felt that. That is
Absolutely.
very much my sense of things. And I think that it's been pointed out over and again that his interior structures, that these, were kind of absurdly overbuilt, honestly. The way he built the interiors of these things was just ridiculously over-engineered.
I love
And to anybody who's built this kind of stuff a lot, that you can do it mostly just by having a kind of well-connected, sturdy, exterior skin.
Perhaps this is the painter in him. He's
Yes,
literally finding this out.
right.
He's discovering it as he
Yeah,
works.
exactly. That he needed that kind of physical bodily involvement,
That's wonderful.
if not to find the form, because there's little evidence that he actually ever made any significant changes from the plan while building. but that the process, the being in there, literally inside that thing, brought a kind of meaning and a kind of depth to the work for him, or connected him to the work in a way that was really important for him, at least. That it brought gravity to the work.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say this image it's a little blurry, but I love this one because there's so few color images of this.
Yeah.
We're going to move on to this piece, but it reminds me so much of what you were just saying earlier, a slide prior to this, about the cartoon, the cartoon imary, or
a little bit. A little bit.
This is X, of course, from 1968. Did we? 67,
68 to 69, I think. Yeah. This piece, I remember. So I started studying sculpture in the Midwest, first at a college in Minnesota and then in Michigan before moving on to my graduate work at Yale. But I remember picking up, I think it was an Art in America or maybe an arts magazine in 1975 in a college library. And seeing, in addition, I guess it would have been 5 years old at the time.
Yeah.
But I was just trying to take in everything I could. And seeing this on the cover of a magazine, and I think I described this to you yesterday, Bill, it just really burned a hole through my brain.
Absolutely.
This is one of those things, one of those pieces that somehow made the difference for me.
Right.
That I guess I can cite two or three works that I became aware of as an undergraduate that were instrumental in me deciding that I had to be a sculptor.
Well, this really is his masterpiece, and
Yeah.
there's so much going on here. There's a simplicity, that simplicity that hit you as a
And a bold,
youngster. Yet, that
yeah.
look at the we've talked about this. What we very well may be looking at here is not a letter. It's really probably a figure, right?
Well, it's all of those things, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's fascinating. I think the resonance of the form, that is the only word I know to talk about this,
yeah,
is multifaceted, is multivalent. It is, the fact that the X is actually not the kind of X you might make, when you're doing math. It's these two, if you look, the trajectory of the diagonals don't connect from top to bottom, right? In fact, there is something like a torso in the middle, right? That connects and it is as much arms and legs as it is a graphic symbol.
okay.
But it is a graphic symbol.
It is.
We could do a long, exegetical analysis on the cultural sources of the figure too. It appears in many places across cultures and times.
Well, and the
I
brilliance of
Yeah,
this
go ahead.
is that probably you saw this installed in the Corcoran Museum, where this image is center images, and it is so placed to produce the most optimum tension. It's as if it really does not belong there, and you can see on the left, the upper left, how out in open space this metal version does something completely different.
Yes, absolutely. It loses. I mean, honestly, it loses much of its poignancy for me, anyway.
Yeah,
I mean, it's still a wonderful thing. No, I think the real meaning and poignancy, the clarity, the vision of this piece has to do with the way it addresses the kind of authoritative and historical and ornate architecture of the Corcoran. And
absolutely.
that the X and I think that is that relationship that, at least in my view, and I don't really know what's out there to support this, but in my view, it is the most political of his works.
Oh,
That
brilliant.
considering the time, 68, 69, the height of our involvement in Vietnam, and Ronnie had been involved in all sorts of kind of countercultural and political and anarchist, actually, I believe, groups as a much younger man.
Wow.
But the X in this context for me is overwhelmingly, I mean, beyond everything else, is a symbol, is a kind of a refusal, or it is saying no,
A negation.
cancellation, it's an exclusion. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, in a different time, Mark, and we'll move forward,
Yeah.
at another different kind of point in time, the X would be kind of, you make your mark, you actually make an impact on
Yeah.
something. But I totally agree with you that in the time this was made, I think it's doing something completely different.
Yeah.
And
And I
as
was just saying, yeah.
no,
Well,
go
we
ahead.
need to move on. I understand. I was going to say that I think that sense of being an obstacle or a kind of an erasure
Yeah,
or a barrier,
yeah,
whether you see it as a figure that is setting itself up as a sentinel, to keep you from entering that historical space, that arena,
absolutely.
or whether you see it as a symbolic cancellation. It works on either of those levels. Either of those levels supports, in my view, a political reading.
Could not agree more. As he moves forward, we're gonna take a look at a couple more
Good.
before we get to our pinnacle here. Tell us about this one. This is Cathedral Evening, right?
Yeah, and this is what, 69, I believe.
No,
Uh,
correct.
yeah, I've got to say, and I'll be honest here. I've never taken to this piece. I've never really liked this piece.
Uh-huh.
But I also recognize its importance and that it was a major. It's always been seen as a major piece. So I think for many artists, it's the most important, or at least one of Ronnie's most important achievements.
Yeah.
It is, the thing that it raises for me is the question of symmetry. It seems to me that it is conceived in plan. Most of Bladen really conceived is the right word. These pieces in particular, most of these pieces, until much later in his life, were really conceived in the abstract. He would lay in bed, is my understanding. I believe in the book, in the catalog that you referenced earlier, there is some discussion of this, but that he would sit for days on end and think. He would literally think these pieces into form. What that, of course, means ultimately is that the pieces are that limits the complexity ultimately of what one can conceive. I mean, a human capacity, even if it's exceptional, our capacity to fully imagine complex three-dimensional forms is quite limited. And so I think that this piece was conceived really looking down. In other words, this V connected by two pedestals, where I think all the other works we're going to be looking at were really conceived more against the landscape, in plan, or in elevation, excuse me.
Well, and as an artist yourself, Mark, you know that art making is a bit of a trajectory. It's a linking of ideas from this one to the next. And you can see that this idea of the X, he was trying, where do I go next, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, perhaps, right. Yeah, this is immediately following X, I believe. That's right.
It is.
Yeah.
And there's still this kind of figurative quality, yet there's a little bit of a movement in this one. And what I really like about it is this subtle angle upward, which we're going to start to really.
Yes. So yes, let's just stay with that for a second if we have time, Bill. Yes, there is the incline movement of the big V, and of course the spatial drama of that thing as it cantilevers way out into space. That drama is essential in Bladen. This sense of, there is just a kind of, oh my God quality, a gee whiz quality to many of his works.
Yep.
What's most interesting to me is that even in a piece like this, which is entirely symmetrical, as comes through, particularly say in the center view in your images on the left there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you compare that then to the large image that we have, you can see the way the slight angles, right? Those sort of 10 degrees angles of the two plinths on the insides and the outsides of those two plinths skew everything a little bit.
Correct.
So that we never really, in fact, because of its size and our relationship to it as we move, we never really see it, or rarely do we see it as a static, stable, symmetrical thing. It seems always to be in a state of sort of a shifting motion.
That's beautiful.
And so, this is the thing perhaps that Bladen has most in common with minimalism, is that he wants the work to call into question the reliability of our own perception.
Right.
Anyway, I know we want to move on.
Oh, well said. I mean, absolutely well said. Such great points. And that Cathedral Evening, so much different than Black Lightning, which is. Yeah. And I also wanted to mention before you get going, the sketches that I'm including here are in our exhibition. So, they are in our museum right now, along with many of the maquettes for these works. So,
and Bill, I have not, because of our circumstances here, I have not actually been able to see the exhibition.
Well,
What can you tell me? What about is the size of that drawing?
we're probably looking at a 48 by,
So
35-inch.
good size drawing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something he probably made on the wall or on the floor.
Very,
And,
very mechanical, very draftsman, very attentive to the correct approach to designing
Yeah.
something. But I know that you mentioned to me this idea of drawing impacting the sculpture, and I think this is a great way to bring that in.
Well, I think there's actually a really good comparison to be made to David Smith, the great American sculptor most associated with AbX in the 60s. So David Smith was really a painter and was his thought of sculpture ultimately, I think, is a kind of a thickened, materialized iteration of drawing. And to some extent, that's true of Bladen too, that his works are conceived really in two dimensions. It's something you see from many painters, great painters who become great sculptors.
Yes.
And then there is, once they are conceived in two dimensions, right, then you see this sort of twisting and turning, right? Taking a leg or that front bottom element, right? And just turning it 10 or 15 degrees, right? To add a kind of subtle spatial complexity to the work. And to break up or slow down, I think, the kind of the sort of clean and fast spatial trajectory of the piece, right? By giving it a shifting axis or interrupting that spatial axis to slow it down a little bit. But the pieces still, they don't really move in a fully dimensional space. And that is also, I think it's important to say, there's also their strength. From some perspectives, you might say it's a limitation. I think it is their strength. In other words, that what Bladen wanted, particularly for these public pieces, which become, what he's most remembered for, I think, is this strong, bold, clear, graphic image, something that would insert itself in the landscape and create just a visual, a dramatic visual impact through its shape. And you don't get that if what you end up making is something that is much more subtle in a three-dimensional sense. You really have to kind of choose one or the other. And but the other result of that, and this piece is the best one, I think, to talk about it, is this idea that the piece becomes a register of its own identity, in a sense, like a logo. So, lightning, this called Black Lightning, right? And the work is in some ways almost a kind of a cartoon characterization of lightning.
Absolutely.
And again, I love his generosity in that.
Yeah.
There's no, he's open, and if everything I knew from my conversations, from my few interactions with him, support this. His generosity. He wasn't trying to make difficult, particularly challenging works of art here. He had nothing at stake in being particularly esoteric about his work. He realized what he was doing and who his audience was, which becomes a really fascinating thing when you consider that one of the other people who is up. Well, let's get to the Peoria piece.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Well, and I would just add to that, and there really isn't much to add to that, Mark, but there is, going back to the romantic in Bladen, this ever kind of continuum of lift and movement and looking toward the sky, the heavens, which is so almost, I mean, absolutely classical. I mean, it goes beyond even modernism. I mean, we're talking about an incredibly romantic approach, which brings us to our kind of the piece that we're so proud of, and the reason that I really wanted this show to come, which is the Sonar Tide in Peoria. The Black Lightning piece precedes this. It's the piece that he does before this one.
Yeah, just a couple years between them.
Yeah, and just real fast, for those who may not know, our own Civic Center here was the precipitating factor that brought Sonar Tide in the early 1980s. The great Philip Johnson was commissioned to create our Peoria Civic Center, and he specifically wanted a work by an American master to accompany the Civic Center, and so therefore we have Sonar Tide, and that image on the left-hand side, you can see that emerging from a warehouse in Peoria, Illinois. It was actually constructed in Peoria, and so we're just really proud to have it here. What can you give us?
Amazing! It's amazing. It is so incredible, really, that Peoria has this piece. It is one of, you know, I think in my mind, it's Bladen's sort of crowning work. It's his latest public work. He did his last public work.
Correct.
You know, boy, there's so much to say, Bill. You know, we should just mention quickly that Johnson at this stage had become sort of a pivotal emblematic figure in terms of the threshold between modernism and postmodern architecture, right? This is about the same time that there was a lot of kind of contested architectural ground ideology over, you know, what postmodernism was, what it would be. And Johnson had just created, I think this is just after the Chippendale AT&T building in New York, which was so important in architectural history and so vehemently contested. And so this, you know, to have Johnson, in other words, was itself a slightly charged, created a rather charged environment around this work. Johnson was, yes, by far the most important architect of his generation, American architect of his generation. I just want to also quickly to go from the macro to the micro. So when I met Ronnie in I think it was actually 85, the spring of 85 that I had or maybe late 84 and 85. He had recently finished the Peoria piece, and I remember him talking about it. So that's put that on hold. In about 8 years ago, I was bringing my youngest son to a choir competition at the Civic Center. And I had forgotten that piece was there in Peoria.
Oh my gosh.
And I was just so stunned.
What a story.
You know, I was like, oh, of course, Bladen, you know, of course. But it took me, I mean, I honestly, I had to leave my son and then take about 15 minutes to gain my composure and sort of spend some time with the piece. And it was a moment of it sort of connected two worlds for me on one level. But it is a great, great piece. It moved me then. I probably spent about a half an hour walking with the piece, really closely with the piece on that occasion. It was a rainy day, and it moved me.
That's incredible. We share something, and we spoke of this already, which is
Right.
although I did not know Ronnie Bladen to any specific degree nearly as what you did, but I did meet him one time as we move toward this last image I have. And you mentioned that that's the Ronnie you remember. This is
Very
the
much.
gentleman who spoke to me to our class at Woodruff High School in Peoria, Illinois, when probably when the Sonar Tide was being installed. And I just remember this absolute soft-spoken,
Yes.
almost like I don't know, a guru of some kind, talking about art and space and energy in ways that I had never heard of. I was drawing album covers. I didn't know what he was talking about, but it was absolutely magical and
I love that.
mesmerizing. So I'm just thrilled
Yeah.
that I'm talking to someone who actually had some artistic interaction with
So,
him.
do we have another minute to just talk about the piece a little bit?
Oh, of course, of course.
Oh, okay. I just want to make sure I know we're running out of time here.
No.
Okay. Well, the reason I think this piece sort of epitomizes at least the trajectory of his work, that sort of crowns the trajectory of his work. It is in some ways the piece that sort of fully abandons any pretense of the kind of minimalist objectivity.
Yeah.
So we know that he was influenced by the shape of the river and the curves in the river. Those were things that he thought about and looked at. And I know there's something about sonar and fish studies going on at the same time that works its way into the title.
Right.
For me, that curve has to do with is two things. It's a curve on the one hand that addresses the sky and the cosmos, right? I think you can see it as a kind of a curve of, what is it, a sextant or an instrument, or an instrument that's used to navigate at night. I'm trying to think of but it's a curve that's very much, in my mind, kind of a cosmological, celestial curve, but it's also a wave. And it's a kind of about connecting water and sky. It also, I think, more than any of his other works, I think really takes up a kind of spatial agenda in a way, in a more forceful and overt way. So cutting that curve out, it's important to recognize that the entire sort of history of modern sculpture is really wrapped up with space, the very notion of space, that is thinking of sculpture as much as an act of shaping space, giving a clear shape to space as much as to material. That the understanding that any act of shaping material is necessarily also an act of shaping space, and that space becomes it's a scientific notion in the 20th century, right? It is. It has to do with our dreams, our aspirations, our frontiers. If we think about something like the St. Louis Arch, which I think is actually an interesting parallel to this piece. Yeah. It's also, of course, has to do with physics, with all sorts of discoveries about subatomic, subparticle physics, but it is at the same time a philosophical concept. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, Mark,
yeah.
There's this, I guess, astral kind of connection that you're bringing up. It's so paradoxical because you have this heft of the weight,
right?
The shape,
exactly,
of the shape, but it's heavenly. And in this image, I cannot help but see like an archer. Like there is.
Oh, that's true. That's great. I hadn't seen that. I like that.
yeah, this gesture of kind of launch, the launch of, I don't know, but there's so much
But
absolute.
again, addressing space in the sky.
Yes,
And
yes,
that's,
I
and
think
that's
that's absolutely
another metaphor for that, really.
on the upper left. You see that image of it getting hauled.
Yeah, I love that.
And
Yeah.
I wanted to mention that Sonar Tide was essentially purchased by the Junior League of Peoria for Peoria, and it was a gift to the city. And I would be remiss in doing this talk with you without mentioning that the Junior League is now investigating a course of action to bring about some means of restoration for this work.
Yes.
I want to make sure that they are noted, and it's understood how much they understand what this work is.
And let me just say, Bill, I mean, from my perspective, what an extraordinary vision they had.
I totally
I
agree.
mean, really an absolute, a visionary leap in terms of a city like Peoria, very much, a working city, right?
Yes.
But to understand that the city could come to embrace and really identify with a work like this,
It's exactly well.
it really was an act of great vision. And I just wish more cities, particularly cities the size of Peoria, were able to have such amazing public works. It was that of course is also very much a thing of its time. That this was the very heyday of public art too, with the 1% program and things which have since gone away.
Well,
But
you have illuminated so much for us, Mark, and I feel like I really allowed you to just scratch a little bit of the surface of what you have to offer.
we could go on.
We're going to bring you. Well, we are going to bring you to Peoria, and we're going to make the most of your talents for sure. And I want you to come see the exhibition, please.
Good.
It's
Well, I look forward to seeing it.
September 6th. So, Mark, I want to thank you, Mark Holmes from Knox College, and just an amazing look into a modern master. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for watching. Hopefully we will be back soon with another viewing room for you to see. So thanks for tuning in, and have a great evening and a great holiday weekend.
Thank you, everybody.